Welcome to GlobalFest's Human Rights Forum. Please welcome our moderator for the day, Jill Croteau from Global News.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for reserving your lunch hour for this discussion. I've been privileged and very humbled to be the host throughout this week, moderating these conversations. And I have to say, we're really going in an encouraging direction. I feel some progress. I think there's been a lot of learning throughout this. So I invite you all to participate in this discussion. And I thank you for being with us. At this time, I would like to introduce our Asl interpreters for today. They are Kimberly Johnson and Deb Russell. You should see them on your screen. They will be taking turns. So please be aware and sensitive that this conversation is not rehearsed. It's very unscripted. So these interpreters were not provided with a script beforehand. So I just want to take note of that. GlobalFest acknowledges Mohkinstsis as the traditional territory of the Blackfoot people and the people of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Let us begin today with a message from GlobalFest.
Good afternoon and welcome to the GlobalFest Human Rights Forum. My name is Ken Goosen and I have the privilege of serving as GlobalFest Chief Operating Officer. We started the journey of exploring racism and discrimination back in 2005 when the City of Calgary signed on to the UNESCO Coalition of Municipalities Against Racism and Discrimination, and how we as citizens of Calgary could become involved in the process through the lens of exploring practical solutions to address issues within our own actions and beliefs, our community, and then more broadly. The GlobalFest Human Rights Forum, presented by the United Nations Association in Canada Calgary branch, has been offered since 2007 as part of GlobalFest programming to promote diversity, cross-cultural respect, and equality in our community. We're thrilled to have UNA Calgary as a presenting sponsor again this year. This year we took our lead from the activities and protests that have been happening here in Calgary, across the nation, and internationally. Each day we have a different panel of speakers and a different topic. Today's session will focus on institutional change. How do we address policy and practice to address racial biases that are endemic in the public service? I would like to welcome our audiences outside of Calgary who have joined us today through our newest institutional partnerships with the Institute of Canadian Citizenship and the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. Glad you have joined us in this conversation this week. Before the session begins, I would like to thank Jill Croteau, our amazing moderator. Jill, it's great to have you back again this year. Programs like this would not be possible without financial support, and at this time, I would like to thank all our sponsors and funding partners for their generous support and commitment to this collective cause. Thank you for joining us today, and we all look forward to a meaningful conversation.
Thank you for that, Ken. GlobalFest would also like to thank their funding partners, United Nations Association of Canada, Calgary branch, Calgary Catholic Immigration Society, the Canadian Red Cross, the City of Calgary, the Province of Alberta, and the Government of Canada. GlobalFest is also looking forward to continuing partnerships with the Institute for Canadian Citizenship and 6 Degrees Forum and the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. We have a very impressive lineup of panelists today that I'm certainly looking forward to having some conversations with. You, the audience, we would like you to participate also. There is an option at the bottom of the screen, a Q&A. So we would like you to invite you throughout this hour and a half to plug your questions in there. We'll do our very best to get to them. I also want to point out that some of these conversations may get uncomfortable. This is a very brave space, and I want to make sure that we give people that space. Everybody has their own lived experience, their own journey, so I just want to keep this as respectful as we possibly can. Today's session is on institutional change. Going to bring in our very first speaker today, Dr. Aaron Wong. Dr. Wong is a licensed naturopathic physician and registered therapeutic counselor at Butterfly Naturopathic in North Vancouver, BC, where his clinical focus is holistic mental health. Dr. Wong believes that the relationship between the healthcare provider and the patient is sacred and is an integral part of the healing process. He subscribes to the idea that in order for patients to feel safe, heard, supported, and cared for, the physician must actively commit to observing the unconscious biases they may hold in practice and look inward to do the personal growth work that is required to be emotionally responsible for their patients. After experiencing and hearing continuous stories of multiple healthcare providers who were not aware of the negative emotional impact they were having on their patients, he founded the Conscious Clinician Movement, a program that offers workshops and counseling support for healthcare practitioners. Please welcome Dr. Aaron Wong. Dr. Wong, thank you for being here with us.
Hi, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
So talk to us about your lived experiences and what led you to doing the kind of work that you're doing.
Well, I'm going to start with just being fourth generation Canadian. I'm also the son of an immigrant. I have 4 great grandparents that paid the head tax to come to Canada. And the head tax, for those that don't know, were imposed on Chinese immigrants in the early 1900s. I have 2 grandparents that are born in Canada that lived through discriminatory years when the Chinese Exclusion Act was in place from 1923 to 1947. My grandfather was a World War II veteran who fought for Canada and impacted the change of the Chinese Exclusion Act once the war was over, as well as, had an impact towards Chinese Canadians getting voting rights after the war. And so I feel like my history in Canada and my family's history has a great impact on where my passion lies, combined with my education, with being a naturopath and a counselor, and growing up with some racial discrimination. And, I really didn't believe that medical bias existed when I was in school. It really wasn't a big part of my thought process. Others would tell me stories of how they were treated. And I thought, surely, there must be some sort of misunderstanding, or maybe they're exaggerating. I actually believed, there must be something that the patient was doing wrong. It wasn't still until I started really sitting in on patient visits with family and friends that I realized the impact and prevalence of medical bias in Canada. And now I hear stories all the time from patients experiencing bias. And so my own personal work that I had to do to face that bias was to really look at my attachment to education as it is attached to credibility for me. So growing up in Canada and experiencing some racial discrimination throughout my life, I had the belief that I was less than in some way. And so my way of compensating for that was to try my hardest to go for academic achievements and use education to prove my worth as a human being. And I've always felt like this perpetual foreigner living in Canada, and I thought maybe my degrees would make me more Canadian or more accepted. And what I realized is that my whole identity as a doctor became wrapped up in this wound of proving my worth. And I started to realize how this could impact my patient visits. With my worth wrapped up in my patient outcomes, what kind of pressure would I be putting on my patients unconsciously? What else was I not aware of unconsciously that I could be projecting onto my patients? And this led me to my counseling education, where I really learned to acknowledge what my bias was. And I found this process of self-exploration and discovery to be life changing and career changing. And I've seen the positive impacts that my work, my internal work, has done for my doctor patient relationships, and also my ability to be an instructor and a teacher with my clinic interns. I realize the importance of this for all healthcare professionals, which I'm really passionate about, because it is about starting these meaningful conversations and affecting institutional change. Um, and that's how I got here in creating, what I'm creating in terms of the conscious clinician movement.
I mean, that's really fascinating. I mean, I find that there's a lot to unwrap there. And I want to, first of all, talk about this medical bias that you're talking about. I mean, what exactly is that? Is it the physician coming in with this sort of preconceived notions of an immigrant or someone with a diverse background? Or like, what are some of those barriers for people with diversity who have to navigate this in a medical perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. It's all of those things that you said. And, medical bias has various different categories. There are different categories of bias, just for things like research, for diagnosis or procedures or treatment. But my focus is really on the therapeutic relationship and the doctor patient relationship with patients. And, within that comes racial bias. And, whatever bias we're talking about some sort of projection or a preconceived idea that the doctor might have in their head, that prevents them from seeing the human being and the person that's right in front of them. And so when we're talking about bias, it's about the doctor potentially bringing in these preconceived judgments or stereotypes or prejudice into that therapeutic relationship, which can be very damaging, and is something that we need to acknowledge in medicine, and we need to really start looking at that, because bias is quite a normal thing to have, right? Bias serves a purpose. Our brains are wired to categorize people and stereotype, for safety. Ancestrally, that was really important. But if we let that kind of process go unchecked, it becomes damaging and dangerous and problematic within the therapeutic relationship. So that's really what we're talking about in terms of bias in medicine today. It's when those things really go unchecked, and we need to be able to look at that.
Yeah, so I guess it's more sort of the ownership of saying like, okay, I'm acknowledging that I have biases and I may need to check that. And you talk about how people are wired a certain way. So I guess, how do you start to rewire that? I mean, in the medical field with doctors, is there an openness that you have seen from the profession to say, we need to be better, we need to do better, we need to start recognizing that this medical bias is in existence, that it happens?
Well, I think just like anything that we're talking about in terms of becoming anti-racist, um, you know, medical professionals are not an exception to that. I believe that physicians come up against their own fragility. I kind of thought about a term, physician fragility. And, when we're talking about white fragility, that's when those of privilege, react to criticism. And when, bias is brought to light, there might be defensiveness or reactivity. And, physicians are no exception to that, or even all healthcare professionals may have some sort of defensiveness or reactivity to being criticized based on bias. And so there really needs to be like an acknowledgement and a willingness to be able to humble ourselves, to be able to look at the fact that bias is going to exist. There isn't a way that it won't. And it needs to be worked on an ongoing basis. So it's more than just taking like a weekend course or having like, a short continuing education. It's an ongoing process. It actually takes a lot of commitment and a lot of work um, to actually see your bias, because it comes up all the time, and you have to be aware when it's coming in and really check yourself in that place. And that isn't done on an island. It isn't done by reading a book by yourself or simply doing a webinar. It has to be in connection with other people, with other colleagues, working together with trained facilitators that know more about how bias and emotional impact can affect patients. We need to come together in that way to do this work. That's what it's going to take.
And I guess that there's also needs to be a shift maybe in terms of the mentality of patients too, because I think that we assume that doctors are so busy that they only have very short windows of time for us. So to hear you talking about a physician dealing with the mind, body, soul, the whole human being is really refreshing, because I don't think that people are accustomed to that. We think we're going to go to the doctor. I've got some symptoms. I've got some ailments. You're going to give me something and I'm going to heal myself through medicine. But so how do you get the patients to sort of, I guess, unravel what our preconceived notions are for medical care?
Well, I mean, when it comes to doctor-patient relationships, there's a power dynamic there. You know, patients go into the doctor seeking help, and physicians need to be aware of that power dynamic because it's very powerful. What we tell patients and what we say to patients has a tremendous impact, not only physically, it's a mental emotional process. And when we talk about the, divide racially, when we have a white physician and treating a person of color, that dynamic becomes even more enhanced, right? And so physicians really need to be leaders in this, in working on these things themselves, so they can model this with patients, so they can model those healthy relationships, those healthy behaviors. It really is due diligence in terms of a commitment to not doing harm to patients. And that's what it takes. It takes a further dedication to be a holistic physician and consider a mental emotional impact on patients. It really takes demonstrating that within your own life and doing that within your own life so you can have a felt experience and create empathy. That's actually how we grow empathy, is that we have to look at what we're experiencing ourselves and move through our own personal obstacles. I always tell, my students, my student physicians are, really wanting to connect to patients in this way. And one of the things that I really emphasize is that you can only lead your patient where you have gone yourself. And that's such an important thing.
That's a really cool way of, an inspiring way of looking at it. I like that. I like that you're teaching the next generation. That gives me hope. And what I wanted to ask you is, and I'm not sure that maybe you feel like this might in fact perpetuate stereotypes, but would you recommend patients look for a physician that might reflect their own cultural background? So there's maybe more sensitivity there or more understanding. Or do you think that creates too many barriers, that creates too much of a bubble, that maybe the hope is that we have other doctors that can go beyond just their own cultural history?
I mean, I think that's a very important point. And that's been something that's very well known, is that, patients, a barrier to getting adequate health is a lack of cultural understanding. And if we are not able to meet patients in that way, sometimes it is helpful to have, physicians and diversity within the healthcare field that can really understand and empathize where those people are coming from. And, from a mental health perspective and from a counseling perspective, you want your one-on-one practitioner to be able to identify with that felt sense of your personal struggle. And so, obviously, if you have a patient of color and you might be a white person, you'll never understand the discrimination or what that person has been through. That doesn't mean you can't have empathy for it, but you might not ever fully understand that. And so if if that patient is having that particular struggle, that specific struggle, oftentimes in counseling, we will recommend, maybe it might be a better fit that you see someone that has had that life experience, and that can guide you through that process. So I would say it's not always the case, but in those particular situations where that particular struggle, that particular healthcare provider doesn't have a good sense of it, doesn't have good training, or hasn't had a felt sense of the experience themselves in their lives, sometimes it's better to refer that patient on to someone else that might be a better fit for that particular situation. It doesn't mean they can't come back and work with you at another point, but sometimes we need those matches that really align with that individual struggle that someone's going through.
Well, and conversely, on the flip side, have you been on the receiving end of that as a non-white physician? Have you had patients come in and say, I don't want to be treated by someone who looks like you? I mean, I'm saying that very harshly, but have you had that?
Honestly, I haven't had that direct discrimination or microaggression, but it is something that I have thought about my entire practice. So that's a thought that I think is unique to individuals that are not white. And, to wonder whether someone might not come to you because of your race is something that I think about.
And how do you get past it? Is it just maybe the confirmation and the validation from the patients that you're caring for? Because it sounds like you're doing some really rewarding work. Does that kind of fill that for you, or is that feeling of being alienated always there?
That's a very good question, and something that I have done a lot of work around. So when I talk about my worth being attached to academics and attached to achievement, that was a very profound wound for me. And, to have patients potentially not come to me as a result of who I am or my race, it's a hurtful thought, to be honest. And I wouldn't say that I'm completely past that thought. That's something that does come up for me. But what I have learned through working through a lot of my issues in counseling is that a lot of those beliefs that I held were not correct, and they aren't true. And by believing some of those things, I'm actually taking on some of the emotional weight of those that are discriminating against me, which is not my job and I don't need to do. And so in shifting that emotional weight back onto those that, need to take care of their own issues, I accept myself for who I am, and I bring myself forward despite those, lingering thoughts or beliefs.
Well, I thank you for being so honest and raw with that. I think it helps kind of inspire conversations, and I think you're doing some really exceptional, admirable work. So keep doing what you're doing. I'm going to get you to stay with us because I know that there'll be some questions for you at the end. We're just going to transition to our next speaker this afternoon. It's Councillor Reuben Breaker from the Siksika Nation of the Blackfoot Confederacy. Reuben is an active council member where he has held many leadership roles, including Chair of Public Safety, Chair of Crime Prevention, and Chair of Treasury. Most recently, Reuben has worked closely with the Strathmore Mayor and Council to develop a memorandum of understanding between the two communities to address racism. That work inspired Strathmore RCMP to reach out and develop a letter of understanding to also address systemic racism. Welcome to you, Reuben.
Thank you, Jill.
Yes.
And thank you for having me. It's such an honor to partake in this discussion.
Yes, for those of you who are signed on, Ruben and I have a bit of a history. We've had a long-standing media relationship, which has helped really foster this discussion. And I think that there's a real explicit trust between the two of us, which really helps communicate the right message. And most of it is centered around, maybe some stereotypes and the work that you guys are doing on the nation, which I think is really innovative and really refreshing. So, Ruben, tell us a little bit about some of that work that you were doing to bridge that gap with the RCMP and the neighboring town of Strathmore.
Okay. Yes. First of all, I'd like to thank my friend Mr. Wong for sharing his experience. And thank you, Jill, for acknowledging the traditional land that we share. The town of Strathmore, we've last 2008, there was a horrific murder of one of our nation members from a group of young individuals in the town of Strathmore. And, it was so traumatic as, words can't express what we went through in that time. And the mother of the deceased, Melody Amen, she showed so much courage and strength for us to keep our composure. We had a lot of angry people, us in leadership, the community in general. And she organized a candlelight visual at the town lake. Strathmore, we have a lot of us have done a lot of schooling and growing up in the town. And the town itself is called Umsikuki, which means the big corner. So, that's what we called this area years before the settlers came in. It was big corner, and there's history that, that's where the corner of the reserve was. But anyways, nonetheless, so we had a kind of like visual, and it was there that both communities came together. And in spite of the talk that was going around, of course, social media didn't help one bit. Getting facts out or whatever, there's a lot of opinions that really took over, and it didn't help the case. But the candlelight visual we had around the town lake, first we went to the site down the highway on 817, and then we came into town, and we were welcomed by so many Strathmore members who felt our pain. And there's pictures, and so it was very moving to see that and experience that. And it was there that myself and Pat Fuel, the mayor, Denise Peterson, and several other colleagues of theirs, we stood there and we said, we have to do something. We can't let this escalate to the point where our people back home, because after that incident, that murder, our people were scared to come to Strathmore, because it fresh out of Colton Bushy situation, the acquittal of the individual charged, it was open season. That to us, it meant open season on us First Nations people. So that brought back trauma of historic cases and situations and incidents over the years. So we when we were there that night, and we said, you know what, we have to do something to work together to show the people that, you know what, we can get along. A lot of our people have so much history with Strathmore. It's grown to a town of 15,000. I did all my schooling and sports here, and I remember when there was only 2, 3,000. Everybody knew each other, but it's come to the point where a lot of people moved in and don't really understand the relationship over the years. Um, so it was then that we said, we have to, let's meet and really address the white elephant in the room. It's for us, racism is, it's always been hush hush, and society has made us think that it's wrong, that it doesn't exist. So therefore, and our intergenerational trauma is don't talk, don't cry, don't express your emotions, because that was beat into our ancestors. So that kind of, when we talk about the intergenerational trauma, that's what runs in the blood of all of our people. And it's hard to explain that if you haven't experienced it. So anyway, so back to the town of Strathmore, I'm so grateful for Mayor Pat Fuel and his council for coming to the table with us and trying to find solutions to address racism. A lot of people will say, no, it doesn't exist. Well, of course they're going to say that, because they've come so accustomed to those actions every day. It may not be nothing to them, but to us, we live it. And I'm pretty sure my fellow guests experience that as well. But we started meeting, and we've identified. So it came at a kind of a tough time for us. It was an election year; those are always tough, and for both the federal and provincial government. So we didn't know what the future held. So what we agreed on was, let's get a MOU signed and agreed on by both councils at the time, so we could continue these talks. So each governments can continue to work together to address racism. And we've had several meetings and strategic planning and whatnot, and we broke it down to some areas that we're still yet to work on. It's a living document, and we've identified 7 areas that we want to work on. One being education, the education system within the town of Strathmore, law enforcement, the RCMP. We recently approved a letter of understanding between RCMP, Siksika, and Strathmore. Housing issues in Strathmore, healthcare. My fellow colleague explained some of the issues that occur in healthcare. It's most recently in the East Coast there. A Native lady, passed away, and the healthcare workers were making fun of her. I mean, it's hard to describe what we go through. Also, sports. Sports is another area where racism is very high. Human services within the town, and economics. The businesses. Just briefly, our people go through a lot of situations in the local Walmart where they're being followed, thinking that they're stealing and whatnot, and just little things like that are it may be their job to do that. They're probably told to do that, but nonetheless, the mental impact it has on our people and our morale, that we're less than. So the town of Strathmore, I can't describe in words how grateful I am, and then for them to work with us on this, but also this new chief and council that we have now. They've committed to working on that, and so there's a lot of work to be done.
I mean, I'm curious, did that take some convincing somewhat from the leadership team to the rest of the community to foster that trust with the RCMP, with the town of Strathmore? Because I mean, this is not just an issue that, you know, permeates the borders of Strathmore and Siksika. I mean, this is across the nation. I think there was some trust broken because of the missing and murdered Indigenous women with the RCMP. I mean, there's a whole history there to unwrap. But I guess back to my question, did that take some convincing with the rest of the community to sort of endorse it along with you?
Yes, it was very hard to, I guess, lead by example, because not every Napi, so every white person is racist. You know, there are very good people in society. So, you know, one bad apple ruins it for the rest of the basket, and vice versa. But nonetheless, you know, a lot of our people, with the anger that, you know, with that murder that happened, that kind of, you know, took off, a lot of things bottled up unresolved issues. Another incident was the flood, where there was a very traumatic in 2013. So these traumatic situations brings out anger in our people because of historic systemic racism that's been going on for years. You know, so even with the RCMP, you know, we're working on a really good relationship with the Galician detachment. I work with them very close personally, as chair of crime prevention and past leadership, and then this leadership here. So we've developed a relationship there. But even that system, when we talk about institutions, you know, that institution of the RCMP, you look at historically what they were meant to do, you know, and that was to, you know, they're the ones that took the children away from the parents back in the residential years, you know, so it's that trust for them isn't there historically. Even myself, you know, I don't have the greatest past, but when I see an RCMP vehicle, it's automatic guilt, because it's instilled that they're bad guys. And the Blackfoot word is inequities. That means those that capture. So that's the Blackfoot word that we have, because they capture you. So, you know, historically the presence of them isn't really a good one. But we're trying to change that, you know, especially with the Galician RCMP. You know, no relationship is perfect, but we're working on it. You know, with our, you know, CTA agreement, and, you know, with things, we're trying to work together. But that's, you know, we're working on that. But most recently in the town of Strathmore, you know, that's the new one that's fresh that we're going to be working on. And you know, it's sure there's going to be barriers there. There's going to be, you know, our role as leadership in our community is very, very tough. You know, we have to deal with the governments, the higher ups, and then go home and try and tell that to the people when they say, why are you talking to those white guys? So, well, we have to, you know, we have to build that relationship. We have to work together to find a solution. You know, we could bang our fist on the table all day long, but as long as we, you know, the goal is to come out of, you know, any dialogue with a solution. So, you know, the Strathmore RCMP detachment, that letter of understanding, that's still fresh. There's going to be a signing ceremony in the very near future. It's a tripartite agreement or letter of understanding. So there's a lot of work there. So it's going to be interesting, given that they have no official affiliation with Siksika, like the Galician RCMP detachment. We don't have a CTA agreement with them, but nonetheless, they, you know, our Strathmore, our people are in here in the town of Strathmore every day, and we contribute to the economy and, you know, everything like that. But unfortunately, you know, the law enforcement component is something that we have to tackle.
Is there a sense of hope that maybe over time, you know, as a result of the Truth and Reconciliation hearings, you know, that people, I mean, nobody will ever truly understand the trauma of the 60s scoop or the residential schools unless you've walked that journey with your family. But do you find that there's maybe more of a willingness to understand and empathize with the history that's never really going to go away?
Mm-hmm. You know, Jill, that's a question that just this morning I drove my daughters to school, and they go to school in Strathmore. And my daughter, who is in grade 10, she told me, Daddy, I got two exams today, a math exam and an Indigenous Studies exam. I said, oh, okay, that's good. You know, it's good to hear that, you know, that's part of the curriculum. And I said, how many students are in there? And she said, about 12, 13. I said, how many are white? She said, one. So, you know, it goes to show that even though Alberta education included it in as a subject, but at this point it's obviously just an option. You know, it should be the other way around, where it should be 12, you know, non-native kids learning this. You know, our kids, my daughters, and all the others, I'm sure they learned at home. You know, we know our history and whatnot. But yeah, so it sounds promising, but I know in my role, Jill, what I've learned in the last 4 years is it's not going to change unless the governments have I guess, the courage to make changes. You know, much like in my situation, we over the years we made some pretty substantial changes that turned some heads, and that's what it takes to make a difference. And so I challenge the Alberta government and the federal government to step up and make some changes, because they're the ones who can make this change in these institutional situations, in healthcare, in education, in law enforcement. So when you talk about the TRC calls to action, and you know, even UNDRIP, to us, that's just another document that doesn't really have teeth. Sadly, we've been told promises and so forth over the years. So when we see those 94 calls to action, and I've spoke directly to ministers and the premier on these calls to action, and federal ministers, you know, there's no plan for it. It's a nice document that's just going to sit on the shelf. And you know, there's good ideas in there, but there's just no teeth. And you look at you know, repercussions to situations that arise. You know, right now in the East Coast, you know, you look at the RCMP, and no wonder why a lot of our people don't trust them. They're letting all that happen. If the tables were turned, the jail cells would be full of our people and charged. But when we see that on TV and on social media, when it's captured, on video, it just angers us. And that anger comes out. As much as we're on a healing journey, as much as we want to heal, when we see stuff like that, and even if it's across the country, it still impacts us here on the West, because we feel that pain, we feel that anger. So we're all connected in that capacity.
Well, and I think that you and your fellow counselors have really demonstrated by example. Do you think that that's the advice for other leadership teams, is to be bold, be brave, and maybe don't get so tied up in I don't know how to say this. You know, because I think that there's so much politics at play, and people are like, well, I don't want to make this decision. It might be unpopular. And what if it, you know, it ruins my chances for running for council next term? You know, I mean, you've really dismissed all that noise. I find you just go for it.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be your advice for others?
Well, you know what, Jill, we've what I've learned in my short tenure in leadership is we are Indian Act agents. We have to follow this Indian Act that was created well before the treaties were developed and put upon us to sign. So the government back then, Canada already had our plans already laid out. And then this treaty came in and promised us all this, killed off the buffalo, made us dependent on the government. They said, we'll take care of you. Back then, there was the population wasn't as much as we have now, but nonetheless, the concept was there. So as leaders back then, we said, okay, we'll trust you that you'll take care of us. Our education, our health, our basic needs. So now to modern day, me as an elected leader, I have to follow this Indian Act and I have to abide by it because of funding of agreements and so forth. And when we speak out, we're kind of put on the back burner because we're ruffling feathers. So over the years, a lot of leaders, or I'll always respect the hard work that previous leaders have done, because I can't imagine over the years, all that we go through. But nonetheless, it's we've evolved to the point where the newer generations are more vocal. The newer generations have gotten an education. We have doctors, we have lawyers, we have judges. Our chief is a chartered accountant. Siksika, we have a scientist who's doing work in the States. So we've come to the point where we caught up. And those that knowledge, and we can talk the same talk now. But most importantly, we can't forget our history and our language and whatnot. But nonetheless, so yes, it's my message is yes. Don't be afraid to speak up, because that's why we're here. To challenge this Indian Act that governs us and controls us, and all these criteria that we have to follow. My colleague was talking about the health field. Health Canada and AHS are telling us how to heal. I mean, we woke up in the last 5-10 years and we said, whoa. We had our own medicines. We had our own ceremonies to cleanse us. We have our ways. And, it's a wake-up call. So my message is, don't be afraid to speak up. Never walk away from a meeting when saying, I should have said this.
Thank you, Ruben. I love the unfiltered way and unapologetic way that you deliver things. I appreciate that. We're going to shift things over to our final speaker of the afternoon. Haider Hassan has held positions in various leading financial institutions and most recently was head of wealth management of First Calgary Financial before joining Immigrant Services Calgary in February 2019 as their CEO. Hyder, thank you for joining this conversation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and to all the attendees that signed up on their lunch hour.
Yeah, it's really inspiring to see that. Talk to us a little bit about your lived experience and your connection to our city.
That's right. So, so thanks again to panelists and respected guests and attendees. So I work as the CEO of Immigrant Services Calgary, and we unleash the economic, social, and civic potential of newcomers that come to our great city. So the lived experience, I have three things to discuss with you. My own lived experience. I'm going to talk a little bit about policy actors and how we can create a society that we want to see in the future. And then in the end, I will close off by some action by some of the things that Calgary is doing to be world-class in being a city that is actually a champion of diversity and inclusion. So lived experience, I'm a son of immigrants that came to the country in 1999 in Ontario. I moved to Alberta in 2013. And that was actually the first time I witnessed some comments about our province that I remember a finance mentor of mine said to me, "Are you sure you want to move to Alberta? Because, you should check the color of your skin." So we both had an awkward laugh about it. And I came to the city. I'm part of the Rotary network which is like a community service organization. So the first thing I always do when I go to a city is I try to attend a Rotary meeting to see, what the city is all about. And my first Rotary meeting, I remember that the Mayor Nenshi was speaking at that meeting, and I looked at him. He kind of looked like me, and I believe he was the first Muslim mayor in North America. So that kind of an anxiety that I had about the city was just immediately taken out. The second thing I noticed was, the Alberta culture of, get it done attitude. It doesn't matter where you come from, the welcome wagon concept, right? Where you're coming in from any part of Canada, whether you're from the East Coast, you're from the West Coast, you're from the prairies, you will make it here. And I think that meritocracy is something that I think exists here, because how could a person, I was thinking to myself, like, I look a little bit different, maybe have a little bit of an accent, and I was able to make, senior management positions in some really great institutions, people that took a chance on me. So that's my lived experience personally. However, for my parents, it was a slightly different story. They have an accent. They weren't able to make friends easily. So I remember my father kept on saying, well, Canada is not for me. I'm rejected here because I don't have quote unquote Canadian experience. So I think now the lived experience, that's why I actually decided to leave my finance career and come to Immigrant Services Calgary to create a strategy and try to do something with a view from the balcony. And I think that's the part that I was going to talk about as point number 3, which is the Gateway Project.
I mean, just before we get to the Gateway Project, I mean, in the financing field, since we're talking about sort of institutions and that sort of maybe under the umbrella of a corporate Calgary, sometimes people see it as a white corporate Calgary dominant.
Right.
Did you find barriers within that for yourself?
That's where my lived experience, I just honor maybe I got lucky with amazing leaders. At Canadian Western Bank, at First Calgary Financial, definitely there was they were all focused on diversity and inclusion. So yeah, but they took a chance on me. And I remember one of my leaders said to me, and he was in awe, he said, the kind of designations you've accumulated here, it takes years to do that. Like, why did you do all this stuff? And I never made excuses. The saying that I kept on hanging on to was that the obstacle is the way forward. And as, Aaron talked about that a little bit as well, Ruben talked about that as well, that, we have heard some really intense stories about lived experiences for our clients and friends and family and so on and so forth. But I was just wired to face the obstacle as a way forward, to prove that yes, systemic racism and issues do exist, but there's a way to overcome them. And there's still leaders in great institutions and finance in Calgary and Alberta that see beyond the lens. I'm talking about, this is like before all this became a big issue. I'm talking about 2008, 2009, 2010, when people looked at me and said, no, Hyder, we think you've got the right skills to be the leader that we see in you, right? And that kind of catapulted me, and kind of this, my mentors, I still keep in touch with them. But again, I think I got really lucky. And I guess my concluding point is that our institutions, why they're best in class, is because of those same leaders. And I think I'm here to showcase those stories of the change that they're trying to make. And I'm a living example of that.
That's pretty cool. So talk to us about this Gateway Calgary.
Yeah, so in a nutshell, what we're trying to do is, we knew that a problem existed with newcomer onboarding. Think of yourself when you onboarded to a new job. You probably sat down with your manager, you had an HR plan, you've probably worked on your 90-day strategy, you learned the culture, you got a buddy at work who was your mentor, right? So there's a whole process that takes place. Well, when newcomers come to the country, there's gaps there, because only 30 or 40% of newcomers know that services like ours exist. So along with my team and my board of directors, we decided to take some bold action, which is the typical Calgary way, action bias. Let's do something about it. And we said, why can't we use technology to start the planning as soon as someone gets notification that they're going to come to Calgary or Alberta? So we are now using technology and some really and a planning approach so that the next time when a newcomer family is coming to the Calgary airport, they would know exactly where they're going to live. They would know where their kids are going to school. They would probably know their friends because we would have set up networking events for them and throw the welcome wagon. That's our culture here. So throw the welcome wagon 2.0, and finally set up networking events so they can actually find a job. And Aaron talked a lot about healthcare today, so I'll give you the impact of immigration from a healthcare lens. Many people don't know that almost 1 out of every 4 healthcare workers is actually an immigrant. So in the pandemic, our heroes, the frontline heroes, they're being showcased. And I'm so proud of that because, in terms of licensed practical nurses, we've got 27% of them that are newcomers. Nurses, aides, and other related profession, 35% are newcomers. Pharmacists, 36%. General practitioners and family physicians, 36% again. Dentists, 39%. And then finally, dental technologies and other related fields is more than 54%. So here's another interesting stat. From 2011 to 2016, based on Stats Canada data, almost 40% of in that entire population that came to Canada are in healthcare today. And how lucky are we? Based on the pandemic, everyone knows Canada is doing one of the best jobs in the world. I mean, our healthcare is really like rising to the top, and immigration has a big role to play in that. 40% of all those professionals are newcomers.
Yeah, those really unsung heroes. It's nice. I'm glad that you were able to acknowledge them because I think that they are doing some heroic work still today. I want to go back to this Gateway Calgary just momentarily, Hyder. Where did you find that that the biggest gap existed for newcomers coming to Calgary?
So the research that came from the federal government, which is the Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, they did a 2017 study and they evaluated the settlement programs all across the nation, and they confirmed that newcomers find it difficult to navigate the system, actually. And secondly, economic immigrants may think that this service is only available for the vulnerable clients who don't speak English. Whereas the bulk of the immigration that we actually are working on and why we are world-class, for example, Germany, Chancellor Merkel, she invited our immigration minister to discuss Canada's best practices and how she can actually get better at immigration. That's how world-class we are in terms of attracting the top talent, right? So I think that economic stream is not utilizing the service because, again, misinformation, they don't think they qualify. And then, there's a lot of duplication sometimes because there's so many avenues. I mean, just from our base estimates, there's 500 organizations in the city of Calgary, which is a great news story for that immigrants can actually access and they can help the settlement. That also includes places of worship. That also includes schools. And there's like 5 big agencies that are working on the system. So the gap was basically, we're not using a standardized approach or technology to aggregate anonymized data to see, can we produce the return on investment? For example, this healthcare study, wouldn't it be awesome to talk about that in the next 1 year? That guys, there's a business case for diversity and inclusion. That if we continue to embrace and work on this panel, for example, it's an amazing example of that, right? And kudos to you for organizing this. If we set this example in the world, well, you know what? Then the best companies will come to Calgary and invest here, help us diversify our economy, increase environmental, social, and governance key performance indicators.
What about those barriers to employment for newcomers to our city? Do you find, I'm always hearing those types of stories that they are overqualified, the country that they're immigrating from, they are, the top physician, and here they can't break through that profession. Do you find those stories a lot?
Yes, I think that's where the data says, only 30% of newcomers are accessing these settlement services. That's the first step of diagnosing what is the issue. Why are they not accessing it? So So that's why I think we implemented the system, because what would happen is in the future, we would do a planning approach and do an assessment. Actually, we're actually not calling it assessment anymore. We're calling it a plan. Just like you would do a financial plan and a state plan. A newcomer needs to have their plan in place. Once we do the plan, that plan then gets transferred to the newcomer themselves. And if they're availing other services, for example, employment services, and we discover like there's a gap with schooling. So when they go to that respected agency, the plan is already in their hands, and so they don't have to repeat their issues. And I think that's one of the small nudges we can do. And that's why Calgary is leading that strategy nationally right now through the Gateway program, because we're the only city in Canada that's actually piloting something. So this is a pilot project for 2 years to help address that exact same issue. There's the economic lens on that as well. So we've got 30 plus partners, and one of the partners is the Calgary Economic Development. So why is the Calgary Economic Development relevant? That's the 3 policy actors that I was going to close my comments on. Because imagine if Mary Moran, the CEO of Calgary Economic Development, if she had a data set which showed that we've got, let's say 10,000 people who can do IT programming in Calgary, and a CEO that's trying to come to Calgary to open up a new office to create new jobs, wouldn't that CEO want to know what talent we have today? And if we have a deficit in that talent, why can't the Gateway program, bubble up to the feds and say, look, feds, we need, 1,500 electricians, for example, and then be adaptive like that, so that we're not like, always lagging 2 or 3 years behind. Because every year, policymakers sit down and they decide the immigration levels on who should come and what are the qualifications of those people. And just my concluding point, Jill, is that that's where the disconnect is. For example, 8 months ago, the Labor and Immigration Minister here said to me that, Hyder, we've got a shortage of chemical engineers in Alberta. Hard to believe, right? But again, that's where we need to be adaptive, and the 3 3 actors, government, civil society groups like ours, and the market working together.
That's extremely innovative. Thanks, Hyder. It is that time in our afternoon that we're going to turn things over to the audience. We have a couple of questions in the queue. So Hyder, Reuben, and Dr. Wong, I hope you're all standing by and listening, because these questions are for you. Dr. Wong, this first question is for you. Some healthcare providers see themselves as open and accepting, but do not see how their bias can be present without their awareness. How can I invite other healthcare providers to examine their own bias when they are perhaps not aware? I would assume that's a very delicate situation. What would you say to that, Dr. Wong?
Yeah, I mean that's a really hard question to answer, but that is a realistic obstacle of what we're up against, right? Really what we're asking for is a culture change. And when we ask people to change, that usually comes up against some sort of resistance. And so, what you're kind of, the question's proposing is like, a bottom-up approach, which is, working with healthcare professionals. And then there's a top-down approach, which is, policymakers and people that can affect the culture and can affect resources, can be part of the solution too. And so, it's the sell of that we can do better, and that this is an existing issue. There is already tons of research and tons of testimony around the suffering around bias. I hear it all the time. And so, to deny that it exists and bury our head in the sand, it is a hard thing to hear from a physician, because it really is happening. And if that is the attitude, then there likely is some sort of harm happening to patients as a result of that attitude. And being open and saying you're being open is one thing, and to actually take action to change your own internal mindset and to change and contribute to the overall culture change in healthcare is an entirely different thing.
I just had a follow-up that came to mind. I mean, do you see that shift yet? I mean, I know you're probably not connected to, all of the country's physicians, but Do you see the pendulum kind of swinging the other way a little bit to that acknowledgement that you're talking about?
I think there's a window of hope among holistic practitioners and those that see holistic viewpoint in medicine in terms of that culture change. But I think realistically, it's a big uphill battle. There's a reason why I'm doing what I'm doing, is because what I'm talking about is not really out there. It isn't something that a lot of physicians are speaking about.
Well, all the more reason to be talking about it. So I commend you for your work. The next question we have, I'm not sure who this is for. I'm assuming it's for Ruben. How would you parallel your experience to governance in other organizations or fields? What advice would you have for other institutions hoping to engage in improving the organizational environment for BIPOC employees and clients? There's a lot there.
I could speak on that, Jill. Thank you. So just on the previous question, in terms of healthcare, I know I used to sit on the health board for Siksika Health Services, who are doing a tremendous job during this pandemic with our, able to mitigate the virus and whatnot. But nonetheless, I know in my tenure on the health board last term for 2 years, I sat on the board. I come across at the South Campus Hospital, there was a launching of AHS Indigenous strategy. And, I commend the effort because and in that strategy, when I looked at the question, it said, being open-minded. And, I commend AHS for being open-minded, because I was in the hospital. I wasn't on the board. I got a shuffle happened in our government. So I got moved out of health at the time. And so, but I was told that there was a launching of AHS Indigenous strategy downstairs in the one ceremony room. So I attended that, and it was there that I found out that what they were trying to do, which was good. They're open to, like, for us, our spiritual well-being is probably number one. Our spiritual connection. And it was in that strategy where, institutions were going to allow smudging in hospitals, or, but also, I think my brother was there. He had a heart situation where, in our family, or in our ways, there's medicines that we have that, we have spiritual people that make these medicines that help us, but we're always scared to say, can we bring this in for our loved one? Because in the past, we've been told no. That's why I spoke earlier of AHS and Health Canada saying, you're going to abide by these policies. So I guess there is some hope, but some of the so that's one side of the coin. On the other side of the coin is the actions of the frontline workers. We talk about institutional change. There has to be repercussions for the day-to-day stuff. It's good to have these these practices that are open to us, but the day-to-day stuff, the frontline workers, there's got to be repercussions for that. So I just want to add that to that, Jill. So back to the question of kind of lost my train of thought. What was the?
It was about your experience to governance in other organizations and fields. And this attendee is asking for advice for other institutions on how to engage BIPOC employees and clients.
Right. So I think it's important to respect everybody's upbringing, their background, because right now it's not there in some situations, in some places. It's some of the areas in terms of governance, governing bodies. It's a job, and So those that work for this area or entity, they're governed by policies and even legislation that are passed down. So these policymakers and that have to consider everybody and put everybody on the same ground, in spite of different races and colors and whatnot. It's important that we see the holistic picture and respect everybody's culture and everybody's background, regardless of where you're from, because in the end, we all bleed red.
True that. Thank you, Ruben. This next question is for Hyder. Our small anti-racism group in Vermilion just had a member put on a newcomers committee here. They are wondering if you have any suggestions that they can do for families who have recently moved here, as not much was done during COVID.
Well, first of all, congratulations to you, Brad, on taking leadership there. And that's amazing that your community is expecting or onboarding newcomers. So I'll be happy to share all of our strategies, because what we've done at Immigrant Services Calgary, we've completely gone to a virtual environment. So what I can offer you is that if you go to our website, settlementcalgary.com, I will post that in the chat box here. I can ask my teammates to put a special referral for your newcomers there. And what we would do then is we would offer them a complimentary plan that I discussed through. And then if you can help me with a couple of organizations that are providing services in your area, then that's great. Then we can refer them. If not, don't worry. We also have a virtual case management that we can do remotely, all online, to help onboard the newcomers and provide some leadership there. So yeah, thank you so much for bringing that forward. You just made my day by asking me that question.
That's so cool.
Thanking Jill, right? Look at that.
Yes.
I mean, look at the stuff that's going on. Who would have thought in Vermilion?
That is like, I'm so glad that you gave Brad a shout out for that, because that is, deserved recognition. I think that's incredible. He's saying, wow, thank you. No, thank you. I think that's just, more, I guess, more of a signal as to how far we've come. Long way to go, but yeah, Vermilion, yay you. So, Dr. Wong, this next question is for you from Carly. Dr. Wong, can you comment on the history of medicine's connection to white supremacy? And do you see this being acknowledged and addressed in the field? For example, a recent study that showed most med students still believe Black people feel less pain. Wow.
Yeah, that's a very big question. And obviously, medicine has big roots in terms of the powers that be that control, finance and big pharma and whatnot that influence medicine. Absolutely. Do I see that being acknowledged in the field? And, the issue of, basically stereotypes and misconceptions around different racial groups, having different tolerances for pain or Black people feeling less pain. I see that as something that absolutely needs to be addressed in healthcare education. And there needs to be more courses, I would say, in dialogues amongst my peers. Some of these discussions are happening, and I've been having some of these discussions with some of my peers. But in terms of across the board education, we need a lot more help in this area. We need a lot more help in education, acknowledgement, and awareness around the roots of medicine, the culture of where it comes from. Absolutely. Like when I say culture change, the roots of where our medicine comes from is deeply rooted. And so that's what makes it very difficult and one of the obstacles to actually change the structure.
Like, is it enough to just be open? Like, is it enough for a physician to say, I'm open to learning about cultural history from my patient who wants to share this with me? Or would you recommend that physicians sort of go out and do the work?
I mean, it's the same question that came up, I think, earlier in this week when it comes to being an ally versus allyship. That it's not enough to just be an ally and be aware, and it's not appropriate for a patient to educate you on how they should be treated. It's your job to actually do the work and be prepared for that patient, and be prepared for considering the different cultural, ethnic, or racial differences that that particular person experiences. And that is a commitment that physicians need to make in holding themselves more accountable and to a higher standard of care.
Love that. Thank you. This next question is for Ruben. Ruben, with the current Alberta government pushing for privatization of both education and healthcare, how have those changes affected you as a leader trying to bridge gaps with these institutions?
Yeah, thanks, Jill. Those are some pretty interesting, I guess, talks. I don't know where they're at, but for us, and any First Nation that's under treaty, we signed a treaty with Canada, and Canada is the one that said, "Okay, we'll take care of you." But what I found, and it's no secret, that the federal government wants to pass on that responsibility to the provinces. And that's our argument. Saying, whoa, the province is kind of like an outside party to this treaty. And we have funding agreements with Health Canada and so forth. So it's very interesting. But my advice to any government that's even thinking this is consult with us. There's a lot of, in any government, there's a lot of questionable moves, decisions that are made, and it impacts us, but no consultation is done. So that consultation is very, very important. Instead of making a decision and say, okay, this is how it is, that's been the trend for 150 years. So I caution any government that's going to do that to at least consult with each First Nations, particularly in Alberta. There's 43 First Nations, I believe, and 43 meetings isn't going to take a lot of, and it has to be individually, because each community is different. Siksika and Gaina, we're the top two biggest nations land-wise in the country, whereas some in Treaty 8 are very small. So the dynamics and the environments are very, and the situations are very different. So we can't just make a decision and everybody adjust to it. It's got to be consulted and deliberated individually. So that's my feedback on that. And I can't speak on everybody else, every First Nation, but for us, it's important that consultation is done.
I mean, what is your take on that aspect of self-governance? Like when it comes to First Nations, do you think that they should continue to have their own chief and council, continue to have, their own police forces? Because some people feel like that perpetuates those, that sometimes reserves can be on their own island, that there's no blending of the communities. I mean, I know Siksika and Strathmore is unique in sort of dividing those borders, but do you think that that's still, that your community still needs to be represented by its own people in the way of leadership and police forces?
Yeah, we prior to contact, we did exist. We had our own governance structure. It just wasn't called that. We had leaders in the community, in our clans. So we had clans that we were far up north and down to the States and all this traditional territory, but our clans were spread out throughout that territory. So when so we had our ways of governing our people, and our sacred societies are the ones that guided us. When you talk about policing and whatnot, we had we have a society now, Ganatsumadegs, that's the Brave Dog Society, and they're the ones who protected the camps, and they're the ones that disciplined anybody that was doing wrong. So we had that prior to contact, but and we had our ways of our elders were a very important part of our, and still are, of our governance and our ways, and teaching our people. So yeah, it is important when you talk about self-governance. It's always every community is different. 630 nations across the country, they're on their own journey. Some are very, very advanced in terms of investments and smart investments, and they're doing good. Mind you, they're a little smaller, under 1,000 people, but that's how creative and innovative they are. But for some of us bigger nations, it's tough. For us, Guyana, Musqueam, Saddle Lake, all these bigger nations, we have almost 10,000 people each, and it's tougher to be self-sustaining, but it is possible. But we're always going to be linked to the treaty, because that's Canada. I wouldn't say Canada, the crown at the time, because it was under the British, monarchy back then, and they're the ones that made Canada. So that's where the confusion is. And if we could only be, if we could have been there 150 years ago, it would have been nice to say some words, because we couldn't speak the language back then. We couldn't speak English. Interpreters had to tell us what this meant. So, but yeah, it's very tough governance these days. Like I said, bound by the Indian Act, and it's frustrating. Me as a leader, I can't stand being a leader under the Indian Act, but that's just the way it is now. Until we develop our own constitutions, there's First Nations that have their own constitutions and can control their education, their health, everything like that. And I think that's everybody's goal, but there's always going to be a link there to Canada.
Well, thanks for that. Dr. Wong, I had a question for you. It was triggered by what Ruben was talking about, just in terms of, that ability. I don't assume that the learning ever stops. It's probably on this continuous curve for you in your line of work, because what have you learned along the way? Because like he says, from the Indigenous people, maybe they want to be able to bring in sweetgrass, maybe they want to be able to smudge or be embraced and given those allowances to have non-traditional medicine take care of some of their ailments.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the barriers to healthcare access for some groups, is that there isn't an openness or an understanding for those beliefs, where we invite the integration of that into the therapeutic relationship, really. What certain groups believe in terms of what heals and what's traditional is really important. And, in a lot of ways, medicine has appropriated those things from other cultures. A lot of pharmaceuticals are based on, herbal medicines and things like that are, mass produced into chemicals. And, a lot of traditional medicines are looked down upon, but we need to acknowledge those medicines as a different paradigm for different cultures, and acknowledge those to be valid and true for those groups. Because it doesn't, just because we have modern science and modern medicine doesn't make it better than other things, other traditional medicines that have been used for potentially hundreds, thousands of years.
I'm glad you punctuated that. There's no sort of hierarchy in terms of treatment. So thank you, Dr. Wong. Carly has a question for Hyder. Considering the large amount of layoffs that have just been announced within the healthcare sector, I assume that this is going to greatly impact Alberta's immigration population. Good point. Based on the stats that you mentioned, how can the average citizen support the newcomers that will be impacted by this change?
Yeah, that's a timely issue. Actually, you raised something that we were discussing right in the morning because, there is a direct correlation to the newcomers. And now there's 2 points I would like to make there. Number one, I think what experts are saying is that those jobs will transition from AHS to the private sector. And so we don't know, what will happen there. So that's point number one. Number two is how can you make it easier for newcomers? Well, if you have, because at the end of the day, one thing that I wanted to mention was that, yes, we're doing this gateway project, and yes, we're collaborating with various levels. And recently also, we actually started a roundtable with, just based on what Ruben was saying, a roundtable with Indigenous leaders and elders to talk about how we can actually integrate newcomers to Indigenous. So we're really excited about that. It's in the early stages, so that I didn't want to talk about it too much, because once we take action, then we can report on the successes. But the second thing I would say, the last thing is that the Gateway project, we're supposed to translate the solution to the community, because if we don't do that, for example, as a neighbor, you see a newcomer family and you don't welcome them. Well, whose fault is that? Is that the government's fault? Is it civil society, or is that the market's fault? So I think again, sounds like basic advice, but just, throw the welcome wagon. Invite people to a barbecue. Again, we're going through COVID right now. So just be careful of that, but just be a friend, because I think the biggest factor to sense of belonging, that's one thing that we research aggressively, is like, how can we actually increase sense of belonging for a newcomer that comes to our city, is friendships with neighbors, community linkages to their places of worship, community center, so on and so forth. So thanks again for that question. Thanks for bringing that up. I mean, that's really timely.
Yes, thank you all. I think we're going to end it there. We are getting close to our allotted time. I just wanted to extend my gratitude and appreciation to Aaron, Hyder, and Reuben. You're all doing some really inspiring work. I'm very appreciative for your words of wisdom and just your authentic experience. I really want to honor that. And I think it's given me some optimism that maybe I didn't have, that we're moving in the right direction. So I really have much respect for the work that all three of you are doing. And we wanted to thank the funding partners as well, the United Nations Association of Canada, Calgary Branch, the Calgary Catholic Immigration Society, and the Canadian Red Cross. Some of what we talked about is actually blurring into tomorrow's session. So if those of you who are still with us want to join tomorrow, we're going to be talking about Indigenous racism in Alberta. So reserve your noon hour for that. Thank you to everyone for sharing your time. It's been a very great pleasure and honor. So I wish you all a wonderful rest of the afternoon.